Jane Austen, everyone knows her, everyone loves her. We've all read her novels, we've seen the films, we've seen the TV adaptations. We know her through gadgets. She is basically everywhere. But do we really know how her novels work? Do we really know the complex mechanisms that inhabit her fiction? Usually, we think that her novels are simple mechanisms. The plots are transparent, they are about love stories.
Miss Elizabeth, I have struggled in vain and I can bear it no longer. These past months have been a torment. I came to Rosings with the single object of seeing you. I had to see you. I have fought against my better judgment, my family's expectation, the inferiority of your birth, my rank and circumstance, all these things, and I'm willing to put them aside and ask you to end my agony.
I don't understand.
I love you.
But in actual fact, her novels are extremely complex textual constructs. They are characterized by complexities of style, themes, ideology. Usually, we read her novels as depicting what we could describe as a kind of orderly, well-balanced universe, a world in which good manners prevail and in which love triumphs at the end. Sometimes we tend to see her novels as something that has been called demure dramas in drawing rooms or in the countryside. They tend to depict a reality which is reassuringly balanced, and therefore we find them fascinating because this reality seems to be so different from the chaotic, troubled world in which we live. However, this is only part of the story. The reality of things is a little bit more complex than this. As we also know, if we concentrate on her novels, her narratives are characterized by dangers, risks. There are traps which are set by the negative characters in her stories. These characters can be silly or they can be manifestly scheming and evil. And both the heroine and the hero, they must learn how to navigate these dangers. They must find a way out in order to reach a happy conclusion. Sometimes in her novels, we also have tragic or potentially tragic events. Therefore, already from what I have been saying, it is clear that the complexity of Jane Austen's fiction lies also in the fact that there are hidden springs, hidden mechanisms. Now, my question is, are we really equipped in order to read these complexities? Do we have the tools that we need to decode and understand how Jane Austen's deceptively simple stories work? In this unit, we will be concentrating on the theme of reading. Reading for Austen, what it meant for her as a woman, as a writer, but also reading in Austen, reading in her fiction and the functions it carries out. Reading was a crucial activity in Romantic period Britain, that is to say, the decades between the 18th and 19th centuries. It was a crucial activity for men and women of the middling ranks, of the aristocracy, but also obviously of the lower classes, given the high level of literacy that was around in England at the time. Where did people obtain books? Where could they buy them or where could they borrow them? Well, obviously there were bookshops, especially in towns and cities. There were also what were known as circulating libraries. These were libraries where people could take out a subscription, pay a fee, and therefore borrow books for a period of time, and then books would be circulated around the membership. These circulating libraries obviously also existed in towns and cities. What happened in the countryside? Well, in the countryside, there were traveling salesmen who went from village to village, from homestead to homestead, providing books, selling them, and also lending them. A critic called William St. Clair has also highlighted how this diffusion of reading materials, not just books but also periodicals, was fundamental at the time in order to create a sense of nationhood. William St. Clair has actually studied how reading and this diffusion of reading actually turned the English and the British into a reading nation. It reinforced the sense of belonging to the same national community. Now, in Jane Austen, we know in her novels that reading, as I said, is always a very important activity, but she also gives us some insights into the importance of the bookshop and the importance of the library. For instance, in her novel Sanditon, the novel that she didn't finish because she died a few months after starting it, we read the story of a little seaside village which is being turned by speculators and investors into a seaside resort, a fashionable place where people could bathe in the sea for their health. Mr. Tom Parker, who is the main brain behind the operation, gives much importance to the local library as a place that will attract prospective visitors, so one of the places where they can carry out one of their preferred leisure activities. In the novel, in chapter 6 of Sanditon, we read the following words.
The party were very soon moving after dinner. Mr. Parker could not be satisfied without an early visit to the library and the library subscription book, and Charlotte was glad to see as much and as quickly as possible where all was new.
Now, this passage is very interesting because we read, first of all, about the importance that the library has as a place of social activity. But we also read about the fascination that the young protagonist of the novel, Charlotte, feels for this place. She's interested in the library. She wants to see the library. And this tells us something else. This is highly relevant. That is to say, the crucial importance that reading had in the lives of women. Reading was a very important activity for women of all classes, of all ranks. Of course, they were great consumers of literature. They read novels, romances. There were also periodical publications aimed at them, so magazines and other types of periodicals that addressed their curiosities and their interests. Let us not forget, however, that women were also producers of literature. Between the 18th and 19th centuries, many women emerged on the literary scene as authors of novels, romances, dramas, poetry, and periodical literature as well. Novelists, authors of romances, were very much aware that women were among the main consumers of their products. However, reading could also be seen as a dangerous activity, especially when it came to the most impressionable members of society, like women, especially young women and young people. Detractors saw that certain types of reading materials, especially sentimental fiction or Gothic fiction, the literature of horror and terror, could pose serious threats to these individuals and to society as a whole. They could inspire wrong forms of behavior, or they could instill forms of immorality into these subjects. At the time, reading was a carefully monitored, a carefully policed kind of activity. Tutors, parents, guardians had to check very carefully what young women and young people read and how they read it. There were also specific types of pedagogical publications called conduct books that could help parents, educators in this task. And these conduct books very normally reserved certain parts, certain sections to establishing what should be read and how it should be read. Therefore, reading in Jane Austen's times was taken to be very serious activity, an activity related to leisure, of course, entertainment, related to education, but also related to the stability of the entire fabric of the social polity. While she was growing up, Jane Austen could read the books in her father's library. This was quite a substantial library. It contained around 500 volumes, which was quite a respectable quantity for a man in, let's say, the social and economic position of Reverend George Austen. She could also read or maybe know about the books that her brothers, who studied at the University of Oxford, would let her know about. And then later in life, we know that she had access to the large library in her brother Edward's country seat at Godmersham in Kent. Now, one interesting thing about the Austen family was that, as Jane Austen herself said, they were a family of great novel readers and not ashamed of being so. Now, this is a fascinating remark because it means that the Austens read novels. They did not consider them to be beneath themselves. They attached importance to this type of fiction, and they were not critical about it. It also tells us another interesting fact, that they read novels together. That they read them together and they discussed them also together with their neighbours, as we also know from some of the extant letters that Jane Austen has left us. Now, the Austens did not only read fiction, not just novels or drama, other types of, let's say, lighter literature. The father was a clergyman, therefore we know that the Austens read sermons, and we know that they read the Bible on a daily basis. Now, when it comes to fiction, Jane Austen was very careful to keep an eye on what was going on in the contemporary world of literature. For instance, we know that when Walter Scott stopped writing poetry and dedicated himself to fiction, to historical fiction, she immediately started reading his novels, and in a letter she remarks that Sir Walter Scott has no business writing novels, especially good ones, and she exclaims, "It is not fair." This tells us that she checked what was going on in the literary market, that she checked what the new fashions were, what the new popular types of fiction were. She didn't only read male authors, she was very interested in female novelists as well. Among her favourites there were Maria Edgeworth, Anne Radcliffe and Frances Burney. Now, Frances Burney is particularly relevant as a point of reference for Jane Austen. She read Burney very carefully, and she measured herself against Frances Burney's type of fiction and style and themes. We also know, for instance, that Frances Burney's novel Cecilia, that was published in 1782, held a particular place for Jane Austen. When the novel was published, it was published by subscription. That is to say, members of the public could give money towards the publication of this novel. And we know that the young Jane Austen, with the help of her father, contributed to the publication of Cecilia with the sum of 1 guinea. And Jane Austen's name appeared in the list of subscribers. But Cecilia is also important for another reason. It is important because the phrase Pride and Prejudice, which of course Jane Austen used for one of her most famous, possibly for her most loved novel, appears several times in the final sections of Burney's Cecilia. Austen didn't only read novels, she also read poetry. We know that her favourite poet was William Cowper. This writer lived at the end of the 18th century, and his poetry is characterised by still some kind of neoclassical forms, but at the same time, the new romantic sensitivities are very much present in his lines. And we also know that he was a poet who interpreted the new feeling for nature, for the landscape, in very deep ways. As for the more recent poets, we know from her letters that Jane Austen read and knew two of the most famous and popular ones, Lord Byron and again Walter Scott. But she doesn't seem to have favoured them particularly. For instance, in 1814, Lord Byron published one of his most successful poems, an exotic story of adventures entitled The Corsair, which sold an enormous amount of copies as soon as it was published. Now, Jane Austen, who, as I said before, monitored all the new movements on the literary market, read The Corsair, but she didn't have very kind words for it. In a letter to her sister, she wrote, I have read The Corsair, I have mended my petticoat, I have nothing else to do. Jane Austen wrote to her sister Cassandra in 1811.
We have tried to get self-control, but in vain. I should like to know what her estimate is, but I'm always half afraid of finding a clever novel too clever and of finding my own story and my own people all forestalled.
Here Austen alludes to a novel entitled SelfControl by the author Mary Brunton. It was published in 1811 and it was a runaway success. And Jane Austen tells us that she would like to get hold of a copy of this novel that everybody's talking about. Of course, it wouldn't have been easy living in the countryside to obtain a copy of this very popular novel. What these words also tell us is that Jane Austen is interested in reading this novel from a critical point of view. She wants to know what her estimate is. She uses the word estimate, which means to assess, to evaluate. So this fact, what she writes in this letter, bears out Jane Austen's critical way of reading. She didn't only read for entertainment or to discuss novels with her family, but also in order to develop her own writing skills. She eventually managed to find and read a copy of this novel, and after reading it, she had some critical remarks about what Mary Brunton had done. In particular, Jane Austen was very dismissive of the improbabilities in the plot of Self-Control, which greatly contrasted with her own type of realistic fiction. At the same time, however, Self-Control sold 3,000 copies and went into 2 editions in the first year of publication. So even if Jane Austen was critical of the actual narrative and the way it had been developed, at the same time she would have been very interested in the aspects of practical success of this novel. We know that Jane Austen wrote also with a view to success. What this anecdote also tells us is that Jane Austen read what she could find. And at the same time, it throws light on another important aspect of Jane Austen's experience as a reader. She read randomly, she read haphazardly. That is to say, she didn't follow a set plan of reading, a set plan of instruction, which was, for instance, the case with young men who went to schools or universities. They had to follow a plan of reading, let's say, that was pre-established and canonically determined. Jane Austen could read what she wanted in a slightly disorganized way, which could be seen as a disadvantage. But at the same time, she enjoyed freedom. And this meant that she could develop and establish her own reading experiences. And at the same time, she could, with this kind of freedom, experiment with different types of reading experiences, reading different authors, and at the same time both develop her own critical attitude towards fiction, traditional or new, and at the same time develop further her own new style of writing, her new experimental type of fiction. Reading is a main theme in Jane Austen's Pride and Prejudice, and it helps us to throw light on some of the complexities of this novel. There are many statements related to reading in this work, and one of them has appeared on the £10 note that has been recently issued by the Bank of England. Ironically, however, although this statement is about the importance of reading and the great pleasure that reading gives us, in the novel it is not pronounced by a character who actually loves reading. So it's very ironic. Reading in Pride and Prejudice serves to help the main characters, the hero and the heroine, to progress in their own process of personal growth and development, both by understanding themselves better, but also by learning how to read society and the world around them. This emerges with particular clarity in an episode related, of course, to the topic of reading, where we see Elizabeth joining Mr. Bingley's party at Netherfield. And on this occasion, the following dialogue is exchanged.
"I am astonished," said Miss Bingley, "that my father should have left so small a collection of books. What a delightful library you have at Pemberley, Mr. Darcy." "It ought to be good," he replied. "It has been the work of many generations." "And then you have added so much to it yourself. You are always buying books." "I cannot comprehend the neglect of a family library in such days as these."
Now, this mini dialogue is extremely interesting. We have one of Bingley's sisters speaking to Mr. Darcy, and in this dialogue, it is very clear that the importance of reading, both as a form of entertainment and as a form of instruction, is at the centre of attention. But there are also other aspects that emerge in this brief exchange we have just read. One is the fact that Mr. Darcy and Mr. Bingley are very different types of gentlemen. We understand that Mr. Bingley, his family, doesn't have a large library. The father did not accumulate a large quantity of books, and Mr. Bingley doesn't seem to have added to this quantity of books. Obviously, their family is a family that has become only recently rich. Instead, Mr. Darcy, at his great mansion at Pemberley, possesses a very large library, and he says it has been the work of many generations. This gives us a very different idea of the type of gentleman and the type of heritage that Mr. Darcy represents. Another interesting remark that emerges from this passage is in Mr. Darcy's words, when he says that having a large library is very important in such days as these. We know that Pride and Prejudice can be more or less exactly dated, that is to say, situated at a specific time. The action probably takes place between 1793-94, 1795-96. This was the period of the French Revolution. This was the period when Great Britain was at war with France. And therefore we can interpret Mr. Darcy's remark as something like having a library is relevant in this period of instability, because a library represents the past, represents tradition, represents a place where the books enshrine the solid, stable values of the nation and of a family who participates to the stability of the nation. Elsewhere, reading is associated with understanding oneself and others, as in this dialogue between Elizabeth and Darcy.
"What think you of books?" said he, smiling. "Books? Oh, no. I'm sure we never read the same, or not with the same feelings." "I'm sorry you think so, but if that be the case, there can at least be no want of subject. We may compare our different opinions." "No, I cannot talk of books in a ballroom. My head is always full of something else. The present always occupies you in such scenes, does it? Said he, with a look of doubt. Yes, always, she replied, without knowing what she said, for her thoughts had wandered far from the subject, as soon afterwards appeared by her suddenly exclaiming, I remember hearing you once say, Mr. Darcy, that you hardly ever forgave, that your resentment, once created, was unappeasable. You are very cautious, I suppose, as to its being created. I am, said he, with a firm voice. And never allow yourself to be blinded by prejudice? I hope not. It is particularly incumbent on those who never change their opinion to be secure of judging properly at first. May I ask to what these questions tend? Merely to the illustration of your character, said she, endeavouring to shake off her gravity. I am trying to make it out. And what is your success? She shook her head. I do not get on at all. I hear such different accounts of you as puzzle me exceedingly.
This is a long but fascinating dialogue. They start talking about books, but soon the idea of reading shifts from books to people, and in particular it shifts to Elizabeth's ability to read Mr. Darcy in order to understand him. During the dialogue as well, we have the sensation that there is a kind of tension mounting between the two of them, especially as Elizabeth's questions become more and more probing. What becomes clear from this dialogue is the idea of analysis. Reading is an analytical activity that allows us to get deeper into a text, into reality, and into someone else, someone's character, someone's psychology. However, Elizabeth at the end has to admit that she has been defeated, that all of her attempts at reading Mr. Darcy have not brought her to any clearer understanding of his character. However, as the novel progresses, as we get closer and closer to the end, Elizabeth has gathered more and more information about Darcy, about the society around them. Her knowledge through reading has increased, and therefore, in Book 3, and we are getting close to the end, she begins to have more details about what understanding Mr. Darcy might mean. And the following words, reported by the narrator, shed light on this process.
Elizabeth began now to comprehend that he was exactly the man who, in disposition and talents, would most suit her. His understanding and temper, though unlike her own, would have answered all her wishes. It was a union that must have been to the advantage of both. By her ease and liveliness, his mind might have been softened, his manners improved, and from his judgment, information, and knowledge of the world, she must have received benefit of greater importance.
Lizzie has grown up. Her reading skills have improved, they have become more and more refined. Now she can say that she understands Darcy and she understands her own feelings for him. At the same time, this brief passage also tells us that Elizabeth has developed some kind of practical attitude. The narrator uses the words advantage and benefit. Elizabeth knows that she could benefit from the knowledge possessed by Mr. Darcy, and therefore, reading his character properly, having arrived at this kind of final comprehension of his mind, of his personality, can also be to her advantage and to their advantage as a couple, but as a couple that belongs to a definite social sphere, and to whose advantage, to the advantage of this social sphere, they can also contribute. There are advantages and benefits in addressing the question of reading in Jane Austen. We have seen that it is a key question, but perhaps this question makes us ask different questions as well. Reading how? Reading for what? Obviously, reading for the plot, reading for the love story and the happy ending. But if we stop here, we only scratch the surface. We should also be reading, I think we've understood in this first unit, we should be reading for nuances, details, for the hidden springs and mechanisms which are present in the acts of reading which we find in these novels. So going back to Jane Austen's idea of reading as analysis, we should also adopt the type of analytical reading that Jane Austen seems to demand of us. In her novels, she seems to be saying, read as you like, stay on the surface, just be interested in the plot, what the characters do or say, but in this fashion, she says, you won't be getting much out of what you're reading. At the same time, Austen seems to be advising us to go under the surface and to analyze things more deeply. It is in this way that, enjoying her novels, we can also get deeper insights into the psychologies of her characters, the social mechanisms that regulate their lives and those of the people around them, and that in the end, we learn how to read reality and the surrounding world more deeply and appropriately. Austen invites us to adopt an analytical way of reading, a way of reading and interpreting reality that takes in all useful clues in order to understand ourselves, in order to understand the people around us, and in order to understand the world, the society, the cosmos in which events take place. This is, therefore, a complex way of reading, the way of interpreting Jane Austen's fiction, which in a way is demanded of us, of the complexities of this type of fiction.